All right, we're set to go. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Majid Swalem. I'm a Senior Research Associate at CAPSARC. I'm also the T20 Coordinator for Task Force 10 on Sustainable Energy, Food, and Water Systems. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar titled Sustainable Resources in a Post-COVID-19 World. I am very encouraged to see many researchers, economists, and subject matter experts in the fields of energy and food from different backgrounds and interests joining us today. Today's agenda consists of 2 opening remarks, a keynote presentation, a panel discussion, and task force updates delivered over the course of 2 hours. This webinar is meant to be interactive, therefore you are encouraged to submit your questions in the Q&A box at any time. These questions will be attended to during or after each of the sessions. Dear keynote presenters and panelists, please mute your mics if you're not presenting, and a reminder will be sent to you when your sessions are about to come to an end. Our webinar will kick off by an opening remark. We're very delighted that Dr. Fahd Al-Turki, T20 Chair and Vice President and Head of Research at King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, CAPSARC, is joining us today to give the opening remarks. And without further ado, Dr. Al-Turki, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Majid, and I would like to welcome everybody to our 12th webinar within the last month and a half on a series of webinars that we conducted under the T20 to see how the pandemic is affecting our priorities and our policy recommendations. I would like to thank the lead co-chair, Hassan Ghairi, who is also Sharpa for the T20 for organizing this webinar, especially during these difficult times, and also the co-chairs of this task force. And we are happy today to have Tariq Assistant Director General of the Opec Fund for International Development. We look forward to his remarks after this. I think for our task force, the 10th task force, which is Sustainable Energy, Water, and Food Systems, it's important to realize that there will be a greater impact of this pandemic on our priorities, and we should reflect how this pandemic is shaping our policy recommendation. I think above all, while we recognize that this pandemic is a human tragedy, and above all is most significant civilization threat that we have faced in our lifetime. As you probably know by now, the virus has spread to more than 5 million people in over 180 countries, a rate of spread that we have never seen in more than a century. This definitely have an impact on all our aspects of life, be it on the social side, the health care systems, our economy, and our market. From a healthcare system, even well-funded and established healthcare system have been challenged with this rate of spread. From a social economic perspective, we look at the impact of the pandemic, we see major implications on the economy and on market. The IMF forecasts that the global economy will contract by 3% this year. While they're expecting a positive growth next year, I doubt that we will reach about 3 or 4% positive growth as per their estimate. The reason, because if you look at other indicators, unemployment is rising significantly in many countries, especially in developing countries. And also, SMEs are going out of business. Many also large corporations are facing difficulties managing their cash flows. And from a social perspective, we are unable to meet the needs of the most vulnerable households, including elderly and vulnerable citizens in many places, especially in poorer countries. So COVID-19 has reinforced the importance of affordability, sustainability, and security of food and energy systems, not only during the pandemic, but also after, as the economies and countries recover. If we look at how countries respond to the pandemic, we can distinguish between two responses, and each one of them are difficult to maintain and assess. On one side, if policymakers do not act immediately and lock down their economies, they risk thousands of deaths from COVID-19. And in addition to that, they will overwhelm the healthcare system within the country. And we've seen that in many countries, developed and developing countries. Alternatively, if they shut down the economy and enforce strict social distancing measures, they risk an economic collapse and probably a high mortality rate from non-COVID-19 related reasons, especially in poorer countries. From our perspective, as we are leading the T20 part of this global initiatives, we should learn from previous crises, where global unity and solidarity should be on top of our priorities during times like this. We highlighted in many of our T20 statements that we shared with the G20 leaders that we are needing urgent investments in critical public services and global public goods to first suppress the spread of the virus and then minimize the social and economic impact of the pandemic, and to recover better while supporting sustainable and affordable transition that creates prosperity for all of us. If we turn to the task force and the task force priority, I think many of the priorities that we identified earlier this year and last year with the help of the co-chairs of this task force are most relevant to how government responds to the pandemic, including accelerating the attainment of related SDGs, and also addressing challenges such as energy poverty, sustainability of food, water, energy access, and also local stresses of urbanization, economic and environmental resilience. In addition to these, we should also think about energy security, market stability, and economic and environmental vulnerabilities in light of the development of the pandemic. We also should think about how our recommendations that are related to security and sustainability of agriculture, food, and water supply and distribution networks are affected by the crisis. We are also aiming to establish a broader dialogue on various energy transition strategies in light of the recent development under the pandemic that recognizes the role of regional specific nature of various potential pathways. So COVID-19 pandemic may subside in a few months, if we are fortunate. But there will be definitely a permanent impact on the way we live, socialize, and conduct our businesses. And these definitely will have an impact on food and energy consumption patterns in the near future, if not in the long term. And we should incorporate these changes into our policy recommendations as we draft our policy briefs and before we draft our communique to the leaders of the G20 at the end of this year. From our part as the T20 Secretariat, we issued 3 statements before and after the extraordinary summit or G20 summit at the end of March. In all of these statements, we called for a coordinated stimulus package to allocate resources to businesses, workers, and households, especially in developing countries. Some of the recommendations that are related to the work of this task force include restoring global supply chain, reversing slowdown in global trade, all of which will improve global welfare. It is an event like this and the series of the rest of the webinars that we conducted over the last month that shows the importance of think tanks community and the think tank contribution to meeting global challenges such as COVID-19. And within this, I'm glad that we have with us as a speaker today, James McGain, who will also elaborate on how think tanks are responding to the financial, to the pandemic on multiple fronts. Within the context of this task force, we think that this crisis can play an important role in devising policy recommendations to mitigate the risk of the pandemic on energy, food security post-COVID-19. So I encourage you, and I echo what Majid said, that to participate or actively participate in this webinar and submit your questions and policy recommendations to also maintain our original mandate as a T20 platform of providing research policy recommendations to the leaders of the world. And given the size and the magnitude of this pandemic, I think we should also think about going beyond giving just policy recommendations, but also suggest initiatives for the leaders of the G20 to rebuild a better world and ensure healthy economic, social, and financial well-being for all of us. To conclude, I would like to say again that we are at the T20. We will be working with this task force and the rest of our partners in G20 countries and non-G20 countries to help the world in meeting the implications of the current pandemic. And it is an event like this that brings us together and encourage us to share our expertise. Thank you very much for your time, and back to you, Majid.
Thank you, Dr. Turki, for this insightful opening and remarks. Next on our agenda, we would like to welcome Mr. Tariq al-Nassar, Assistant Director General at the Opec Fund for International Development, OFID. Mr. al-Nassar will present the role of institutions during and post COVID-19. It's a pleasure to welcome you, Mr. al-Nassar. The mic is yours.
Thank you, Majid. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for having me as a keynote speaker, and thanks for inviting the OPEC Fund to participate in this forum. We as a OPEC Fund, we are multilateral DFI, so I will share our experience during this difficult time, and also what we have been doing for the last 3 months. So if I may start the presentation, I'll try to be short. The global situation today is extraordinary and needs the entire international development community to work together. There are complex and far-reaching challenges, and we need to use our unique strengths to provide a breadth of and depth of support. Sustainable energy, water, and food system are deeply interconnected, as are health systems and the wider development agenda. COVID-19 is affecting all sectors on a global scale. We need to bring everything on the table, and the key to this is partnership. For those not familiar with us, the OPEC Fund for International Development is a multilateral development financing institution established in 1976. Our 12 member countries are Algeria, Ecuador, Gabon, Indonesia, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Venezuela. We are unique in providing finance only to non-member countries, non-OPEC Fund member countries. All developing countries are eligible countries, with the exception of the OPEC member countries. To date, we have approved more than $25 billion for development projects in 134 countries. We have a global reach, so we don't focus on a specific region. The OPEC Fund is working with the global development community, multilaterals and bilateral institutions, to mobilize urgent funding to help developing countries mitigate, contain, and recover from COVID-19. we have unilaterally dedicated $1 billion to support COVID-19 impact and recovery efforts in developing countries. Our board approved the $1 billion last quarter. We have a quarterly board approval. So in March of this year, we have approved $1 billion by our board dedicated for COVID-19. These resources are already being deployed to where they are needed most. But no one institution, country, or region can make an impact by acting alone. Working with partners is central to what we do and how we do it. As you see the slides in front of you, these are the co-financiers or the partners that we cooperate with them to deliver our mandate. So we have joined a group of more than 25 development finance institutions, including World Bank Group, IFC, the African Development Bank, EBRD, European Bank for Restructuring and Development, to mobilize billions of dollars. The funding will support the private sector in delivering critical healthcare supplies. It will ensure MSMEs, micro, small, and medium-sized businesses, can access capital, and it will strengthen global supply chains to sustain millions of workers in developing countries. Also, as part of the Arab Coordination Group, which the OPEC Fund is a member, in addition to a 10 DFI, bilaterals and multilaterals, we have collectively committed $10 billion to help developing countries respond to COVID-19. We provide finance for a wide range of projects that meet basic needs such as food, energy, infrastructure, employment, particularly relating to MSMEs, clean water, sanitation, healthcare, and education. The energy operations we finance range from those materially affecting the entire country energy capacity. We finance IPP, power generations, distribution, and transmission lines. And also to small off-grid operations, helping villages and communities. While the OPEC Fund name, or OPEC name, is synonymous with oil, the OPEC Fund has a distinct developing mandate. We are technology neutral and finance the most appropriate form of energy depending on country needs. For example, in the private sector, 70% of our IPPs are renewables, water, wind, and solar. In March 2018, we approved 50 million euro for Nachtigal hydropower project in Cameroon. The project cost $1.2 billion. Once operation, the plant will be Cameroon's largest generator of electricity, meeting about 1/3 of the nation's electricity. And we co-finance with IFC, with the African Development Bank, and with EIB, European Investment Bank, and Proparco, FMO, DEG. These are bilateral DFIs. In addition to MEGA and the World Bank to support the distribution and the transmission line. At the other end of the spectrum, in 2019, a town-sized solar-powered smart grid that we helped support was inaugurated in Haiti, benefiting over 200 households directly and impacting 1,000 individuals. We have approved around $1.2 billion, as you see in the screen in front of you, of finance to support renewable energy operation in 68 countries. This represents 22% of our total energy-related approvals of $5.5 billion. Now, the pandemic does not make any development priorities less urgent. There are substantial gaps in basic infrastructure in many of our partner countries. The challenge is to see through the short-term pain of bringing a new project online to support the longer-term benefits of critical infrastructure. COVID-19 does undoubtedly present challenges in implementing infrastructure projects because of the immediate impact of the lender's ability to carry out due diligence, difficulties for project sponsors and EPC contractors when initiating or continuing constructions, and the potential impact on demand in certain sectors. However, DFIs are finding different ways to navigate these challenges and to continue to play their counter-cyclical role. The current situation will see us focus even more keenly on supporting essential services that are of strategic value to our countries. Making the right choices between long-term and short-term returns is crucial. It requires agility and responsiveness. The Maldives, for example, has limited freshwater resources and is among the countries most vulnerable to climate change. Our long-term goals in Maldives relate to water sanitation. In particular, we are now the largest international donor in the sector. COVID-19 poses an immediate threat to the health of the Maldives people, and its economy. 70% of GDP is driven by tourism. So we have already agreed on emergency Opec fund loan of $20 million specifically to fight COVID-19 in support of the government economic recovery plan that includes a package of economic relief measures. As we have said, the SDGs are deeply interconnected. One of the hardest hit sector during recent weeks is the food supply chain. Our long-term focus is providing holistic development support for sustainable agriculture. For example, we played an instrumental role in the establishment and evolution of the IFAD, International Fund for Agricultural Development, and have worked together on many development operations since. During the current period, we will give priority to supporting projects with partners adept and agile enough to manage supply chain and implementation challenges. We will work with those that have local and sector-specific knowledge to help us respond to quickly changing conditions. In Niger, by working with partners, including the African Development Bank, we are financing a project that will improve food security for more than 1.4 million people by constructing and rehabilitating rural infrastructure. In April, we contributed $20 million to financing facility for OCP in Morocco, a fertilizer company that is an important employer in Morocco, to finance key inputs for its production processes. The company provides nearly 20,000 jobs and supports sustainable agriculture with the goal of feeding a growing global population. A global pan-African supply chain project we are supporting will strengthen global supply chains that sustain millions of workers in developing countries. The OPEC Fund has also worked with the United Nations Industrial Development Organization to strengthen agriculture value chain. For example, the two organizations combine technical and financial resources to help improve productivity and competitiveness of the shrimp value chain in Colombia, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Mexico, and Nicaragua. In conclusion, I hope this provides a clear picture of our current priorities, as well as illustrating how we support sustainable energy, water, and food systems. We are helping to scale up long-term capital for restructuring and building back better across the most affected sectors, including food and agriculture. At the same time, we will continue to prioritize development across all sectors, including energy and water, since to neglect any development priorities will detrimentally affect others. It comes back to my message about partnership. It is clear that we need multiple partners at different levels to achieve sustainable solutions, now more than ever. These partnerships include those on the ground with governments, which have the best understanding of their country needs, capacity, implementation power, and local knowledge. Global development institutions have the knowledge and lessons learned from experiences. We need to work together with governments to initiate, deepen, and speed up progress levels. partnerships among international development and finance institutions to create a much bigger impact, leveraging multiple resources, and partnerships between the public sector and the private sector, both of which have an essential role in the development equation. Events and platforms such as this one today are an excellent way to initiate a further partnership, share knowledge, and generate ideas. I wish you all a useful and informative discussion today. If COVID-19 has taught us anything, it is that we must build a more resilient and equal world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Al-Nassar, for highlighting the role of OFID and the importance of collaboration amongst and between public and private sectors to ensure affordable, sustainable access to energy and food in many developing nations, especially during this pandemic. Now, before we start the panel discussion, we would like to welcome Dr. James McGann, the Director of the Think Tanks and Civil Societies Program at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. McGann will give an opening remark on the role of think tanks during and post-COVID-19 pandemic. Without further ado, the mic is yours, Dr. McGann.
Thank you, Indeed, Fahad and Hossa, for giving me this opportunity to join this group in this critically important discussion. I'll make 4 key remarks, one about the importance of the T20 and G20, the importance of the upcoming G20 summit in Saudi Arabia, COVID-19 and its impact, and specifically its relationship to food, water, and energy, and I would add the environment, and then the think tank response. First, in terms of this effort that is being led by Saudi Arabia, the T20 and G20 in Saudi Arabia could not come at a more critical moment, probably the most important moment in world history since World War II, and underscoring the importance of the G20 and international cooperation. A number of years ago, before the first G20, T20 group got started, I convened a group of all of the leading think tanks from the G20 countries with the idea that the US needed to engage countries and institutions as peers and partners. This moment and the political divisions, the challenges to global institutions and internationalism could not have been foreseen at that time, but what was clear is that the challenges we face are faced by all communities around the world, and that the G20 and T20 have become an important instrument for advancing collaboration, coordination, and addressing key issues. And so this year, the summit, as we all know, is in Saudi Arabia, and they have done an extraordinary job under extreme extraordinary circumstances to move the G20 and T20 agenda forward. And I think it is incumbent upon all of us, and certainly in this meeting and in other meetings, the think tank community around the world is supporting the T20 and G20 in Saudi Arabia, and the need to mobilize to support that at this critical moment, and to work together to join arms and hands to solve the sort of critical enduring problems and these new and emerging challenges we face could not be more important than the moment that we are in today. And so I want to once again show our support for the T20 and the G20 in Saudi Arabia as and at the moment where we need to speak with a single voice, we need to work together as a group of institutions. COVID-19 provides an extraordinary challenge. It is now coupled, which something that I, feel will flow from this, a whole series of new and rapidly unfolding challenges that will once again demand that we, as a community of think tanks and institutions around the world, figure out how to work together to address these issues. As a result of that, and long before this, once again, we were working and a number of think tanks around the world, in Brazil, in Europe, etc., came together around the food and water crisis. And I will talk briefly about some of those elements, but it underscores some of the challenges facing think tanks and the importance of the G20 and T20 once again. There is a need, and I think an impending crisis on the horizon is a food and water crisis. That intersects with the topics that are a part of this working group and exacerbated, laid bare by the COVID-19 crisis. And that is how vulnerable many countries and many people are to food and water insecurity. Complicated by environmental degradation, complicated by energy, the need for energy to essentially deal with some of these issues. And so for that reason, we have been looking at it, Think Tanks and Civil Societies program, what think tanks can do, and as a part of that, have launched into a major study of the food and water crisis. In that, I'll just make some brief remarks about what we have found. One, we have found that, as is reflected in this group and in many others, that a single discipline, a single research area cannot understand and, more importantly, fully solve the problem without taking an interdisciplinary approach. One of the great unfulfilled promises of think tanks is engaging in truly interdisciplinary research. And this area, the subject of this workshop, is an area where this interdisciplinary approach is required, is demanded. The second finding that we had is that there are a dearth of food, water, energy think tanks in the regions where the problems are most pronounced. There is a maldistribution. The vast majority of food, water, and energy and environment think tanks are in Europe and North America, not in the countries and regions where the problem is most pronounced. And if, those are two of the highlights of the study that I would point to, but it calls for, which in terms of this, the G20 and underscoring the importance of the T20 and G20, can show a light on the importance of coming together, of mobilizing funding, of supporting and encouraging interdisciplinary research in these areas. Finally, in terms of the think tanks' response around the world, and in close cooperation and coordination with the T20 in Saudi Arabia, the TTCSP launched a major initiative to mobilize the think tank community around the world. And I am pleased to say that they have responded in force. Now over 1,000 senior think tank executives and scholars from every region of the world are engaged in addressing key issues connected to the COVID-19 crisis. There are 90 think tanks that serve on the planning committee, and there are now 5 active working groups that are engaging hundreds of think tank scholars to address what we see as the 5 critical issues, once again in close coordination with Saudi Arabia and the T20 and G20. One is addressing the public health crisis. 2, preparing national and international strategies for economic recovery and revitalization. The 3rd working group is identifying innovative and inclusive public and private intervention strategies to help vulnerable populations that I would underscore are most affected by the food, water, energy crisis. 4, fostering international cooperation and creating, which is really the theme running through this panel, on creating rapid, responsive, and resilient systems to respond to future crises. And 5, being fit for an uncertain future, helping think tanks explore better ways to conduct research, communications, and funding, underscored by Fahad in terms of not just simply making proposals, but helping in terms of the implementation. And that is the thrust of and goal of the think tank, global think tank town hall to save lives and livelihoods through solidarity and proposing solutions. I encourage all of you to join with us in this effort, and the town halls will conclude on June 30th, where the reports and specific action-oriented, evidence-based recommendations on these 5 areas will be made. And our hope is that they will be, once again, the T20 is actively involved in this, and Saudi Arabia is playing a leadership role, and we are coordinating to make sure that these not only get into the hands of the G20, but in the G7 and to national and regional governments. I want to thank all of you, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and look forward to continued collaboration and cooperation.
Thank you, Dr. Magan, for your insights and for highlighting the role of think tanks in collaborating, mobilizing funds, and devising policy recommendations to mitigate the risk of this pandemic on energy and food security. Once again, thank you so much. Next on our agenda, we have a panel discussion. The panel will be moderated by Dr. Hissa Al-Mutairi, lead co-chair of Task Force 10, and T20 Sherpa, who will introduce our panelists and manage the session. She will highlight the importance of G20 on energy, agriculture, and food in her part. Dr. Mutairi, welcome.
Thank you very much, Majid. And good afternoon, good morning. I would like to thank Dr. Fahad for his support to the task force and for T20 in general. And also I would like to thank our keynote speakers, Mr. Nassar and Dr. James Magan. The Task Force Sustainable Energy, Water and Food System aims to provide actionable recommendations to the G20. But first, let me put in perspective the importance of G20 for energy, agriculture, and food. At the global scale, the G20 group accounts for 77% of global energy consumption and 80% of world's installed renewable capacity. It also comprises the 3 biggest oil producers, USA, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, and includes key oil importers. It accounts for 80% of global trade in agriculture and 60% of agriculture land. The G20 has therefore the potential to be the ideal venue for global energy and food governance by fostering dialogue and driving international action in global policy. At the same time, at national level, G20 countries have adopted different sets of policies and regulation. Some of the G20 domestic resource-related policies are market-driven, others are driven by state ownership or state intervention. The G20 framework provides a unique forum for discussing and sharing perspective. Over the past 12 years, energy took importance in the G20 agenda. Energy was first mentioned at the Washington Summit in 2008. The first G20 energy ministers meeting was held in 2015. At the 2018 Buenos Aires Summit, the Energy Transition Steering Committee was launched. And based on figures released by the G20 research group from University of Toronto, until the end of the last year, the G20 has made a total of 157 commitments relating to energy and 123 commitments relating to food and agriculture. The G20 communiques have exhibited a high variability in terms of number of commitments. For instance, 42 relating to energy in Hamburg Summit in 2017, and 8 relating to energy in Buenos Aires Summit in 2018. This year, the Saudi G20 presidency has the aim of safeguarding the planet by fostering collective efforts to protect our global commons. This aim is particularly aligned with the priorities of our task force, since it includes promoting cleaner and more sustainable energy systems and affordable energy access, promoting water sustainability and reducing food loss and waste. In the wake of the COVID-19 shock, extraordinary G20 ministerial meetings were held this year. The G20 energy ministers held an extraordinary meeting on April 10 to preserve energy markets stability. The released statements specify that clean energy commitments will be discussed in the subsequent meetings this year. The G20 research group has already identified 8 energy-related commitments made during this energy ministers meeting. The G20 agriculture ministers also held an extraordinary virtual meeting on April 21st. The meeting stressed the need to strengthen the sustainability and resilience of food systems. In addition, the Saudi G20 presidency held the first water deputies meeting on May 13 to discuss sustainable and resilient water management and the best mechanism to tackle global water challenges. We are reaching the middle of the year and many G20 meetings will be held in the remaining of the year. Our ambition is that the task force recommendations will help to frame the discussions on energy, food, and water. Before we start the panel and we address the question, we would like to benefit from your presence here and conduct a quick survey relating to energy, water, and food. So I hope you all participate in the survey. Let's launch the first question for the survey. Okay, we see a couple of answers coming. So most actually of our participants see that the COVID-19 actually is significantly impacting their research agenda. So let's have the second question, please. Okay, answers are coming. So the answer is mainly divided between 3 years to more, but few thinks that no effect on this. Okay, so final, now we'll have the third, and I think it's final question. And here you can submit multiple answers. So we'll wait a few seconds. Because it's a longer question. But the answers are coming. Okay, majority think that supply chain resilience is important. Adoption of system to new social norms, multilateralism, impact of global increase in poverty, and food security. Okay. Thank you very much actually for participating. And this will give people in think tanks and us here more clarity on questions or the impact of COVID-19 on the research agenda. I'm sure that also our distinguished panels will have comments on the results. And I'm delighted today to have with us Christophe Bonouet, President of the International Association on Energy Economics, Kenneth Midlock, Fellow in Energy and Resource Economics at the Baker Institute and the Senior Director of the Center for Energy Studies, and Rob Voss, the Director of the Market Trade and Institution Division at IFPRI. Welcome for the panelists, and if you have any comments or we can start with the first question.
Christophe Bonouet speaking. I start?
Yes, hi Christophe. Yeah, please.
Good morning, good afternoon, all of you, and I will leave the floor to my other colleagues on the panel to comment possibly the polls that we have received. I am impressed that there is a quite consensus some consensus on the issue of how long the impact will last, and people are shared between 2 and 3 years or more. So we all agree that it will not be a short-term issue, and I think this is something which is shared in the economist community. But I don't know if my colleagues have some ideas on that.
Yes. Okay. So, and Rob or Ken, if you want to comment, or we can move to the first question, and you can comment when you are. So
I we just jump into the questions. That would be good. We can comment and.
Okay. Okay, that's good. So I will start the panel by having a first round of questions. And the second round actually will be based on the question that we will receive from the audience, and we'll address them to the panelists. Then we will conclude by a final round on recommendations to the G20. So since you, Christophe, already spoke, so I will address this to Rob and Ken, then Christophe, you can comment. To what extent and how is the COVID-19 pandemic threatening food and energy security? Ken, please.
Sure. Well, that is a very big question. I'm sure Christophe and Rob will both have some interesting things to say in response. I want to just open by welcoming everybody, and it's good to see the fellow panelists. And I hope everybody is staying safe and healthy in this unprecedented time. In terms of, I'll focus my remarks on energy security and where I think that some of the core threats, kind of linking this back to the questions that were just asked in the survey, and why I think it could actually last much longer than 3 years. I think some of the threats to globalization that will emerge from this as various countries look to repatriate certain parts of their supply chains. I think that's going to be an impact that has some durability. I think actually that's unfortunate in many cases because I think it threatens energy security rather than enhances it. Typically when we talk about energy security, it gets commingled with comments about energy independence in many cases, and the two are not the same. I think that's first and foremost needs to be laid on the table. Typically when we talk about energy security or secure supply lines or access or any of the things that typically get wrapped up in the discussion, we talk about deep markets, and it's important to understand what depth actually is derived from. It's derived from transparency, it's derived from flexibility, and it's derived from an ability to move in and out of a market via trade. This basically means you need to remove barriers to entry. And when we talk about repatriating certain parts of supply lines, you're actually in many cases erecting barriers to entry, and that can threaten the durability of those supply lines as we go forward. It is interesting to see some of the concerns that have emerged as a result of the COVID crisis. A lot of these from the perspective of the United States have been focused on China. I think some of the reactions that might be forthcoming from the policy space, however, will have much broader implications. And I think understanding those implications is really important. It's an incumbent actually on think tanks everywhere to provide some insights into what those long-term ramifications might actually be. But in terms of what the G20 could ultimately do, I think it really is about promoting transparency, fostering ease of entry into markets so that deeper supply chains, more resilient supply chains, more flexible supply chains can be developed and shared in a robust way across the world, not just amongst bilateral or even trilateral relationships. So I'll stop there and pass on to Rob and Christophe.
Christophe?
Okay, I switch on my mic. Well, I will also comment on the energy, more on water. First, what we all know is that the COVID crisis has brought the world economy to a standstill. Governments have decided intentionally to stop the economies. It is a different crisis than the one we faced in 2008, where the economic rationale themselves brought to the crisis. Here, this is because of the pandemic, because of the health reason, that the government decided on voluntary basis to stop the economy. And now we have to restart it. So the restart of the economy will affect all the topics, including energy security. And there is one issue. So it's important to observe that compared to the other crises to understand what is happening. And for us economists, when we consider energy security issue, we approach that with supply and demand approach. If I look at the price of the commodities, the first commodity to be impacted in terms of ratio before and after the crisis is the oil sector. The oil sector has decreased by 60% in average, the price of oil before and after the crisis. And then you have gas, so all this is energy. And then you have some metals because they are used for construction sectors, which have been also very much affected by the crisis. And and then you have some food issues, and we have some paradox. We can see that the coffee, Arabic coffee, is the first commodity which is increasing, I say, in price. Then uranium, we can understand that there is a balance between oil and uranium, so there is an issue. So the cost of commodity, the price of commodity is one indicator. About energy security, and I will give the floor to Rob after, the oil sector has not shown, to my knowledge, any major shortage, major technical failure. So the industry has demonstrated its resilience. To me, this is something important to remember. We can also quantify the impact of the energy security with energy intensity. For those who are not familiar with energy intensity, this is the amount of energy for 1 unit of GDP. And if we look at all the effort that all the governments have made before the crisis to reach the Paris Agreement, these efforts are not sufficient to reach the 2-degree scenario, but we can wonder now if this effort will not be affected by the crisis. We are on the trajectory, and this is something important. And to finish with your question on energy security, the crisis has shown something important, which is the role of electricity infrastructure. We are all confined or locked down in our houses, and we need to be connected with the internet. We need to make some purchases we need to have a safe and secure electricity system. So this also experience is showing on energy security the role of different energies. This is my point.
Okay, thank you very much, Christoph. Rob, we have heard the view and the impact on the energy. So please give us some perspective on the effect on food.
Thank you, Hossa, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. When it comes to food and food security, it's a two-tailed story. One is we see remarkable resilience of food systems. We haven't seen huge food shortages around the world or major upheavals in world markets. But at the same time, COVID-19 has made clear the enormous vulnerabilities in food systems, and we still face an enormous risk that this health crisis will turn into a major global food crisis as well. I think there's 3 channels of major impact that risk food security moving forward, and as we are in the middle of this health crisis. There are supply chain disruptions, there are enormous demand shocks, and we see what I would call panics or behavioral changes that may risk the security of food for many people. On the supply side, it's very important to distinguish between different types of foods. It's first the markets that have held up pretty well are what we call staple foods, the basic grains like maize, wheat, rice, soybeans, which is a major part of food energy consumption for most people around the world. Those have held up pretty well because most of the production is mechanized. It's social distancing is there by nature. Also the logistic and shipment, a lot of it where it comes to international trade goes on big container ships, and it's not a very dense sector of which could affect because of social distancing measures, the production side. We've seen some volatility, I mentioned that a bit in wheat and rice markets, but generally that has been held up quite well. It's different in other sectors, what we call labor-dense agricultural sectors, fruits, vegetables, where more workers work closely together, also meats and animal source products, particularly in the more processing parts, where we've seen problems and supply shocks. Also there, a lot of in Europe, North America, but also in many developing countries, a lot of the harvesting is done by seasonal migrant workers, and in some cases that has led to supply disruption simply because laborers could not get to the fields. There we also see problems of weaknesses in supply chains. Some countries that don't have refrigerated transports, like in many parts of Africa where they have now curfews, so they would transport a lot of the perishable foods overnight, which now no longer is possible. And we've seen increasing losses along those value chains because now it's transported during the day and a lot of the food perishes. So we see many of these kinds of problems. They're fairly local, but they're concerning and affecting food supplies locally. And also, as I mentioned, they're causing problems of food loss and waste. I could mention more of them, but let me move to what I think is the major risk to food security, which are the demand shocks. So with the global crisis, incomes decline, we will see more poverty around the world. We estimate that with a global economic downturn of 5% of global GDP this year, we could see at least 150 million people more in poverty at around the food poverty line, meaning also at risk of their food security. So the economic downturn and the economic transmission effects are at the moment what we see as the biggest risk to global food security. Not only that, because of the changes in incomes, we also see shifts in demand. People eat more basic grains, and less of more nutritious foods like fruits and vegetables, and also consumption of animal source products has gone down. So we see these demand changes, but basically also risk, but not just food security in terms of food access to all types of food will decrease, but also a shift to less nutritious foods, which could affect health over the periods of time moving forward. And that's where you have one of the more longer term effects which you see. And then lastly, and I'll stop there, is the third element, which are called panics. You've seen panics, and well, you may have seen it in your own food stores or supermarkets where people hoard and they're afraid that their food supplies and other supplies may run short. So you get more than you normally need and then leave not enough for others. But we also seen countries doing the same thing, imposing export bans, trying to protect their domestic markets, ensuring there's enough reserves for their own populations, but then reducing availability of those foods in other markets. We've seen that particularly affected by some export bans on rice product by some countries and on wheat by other countries. And that, as I mentioned before, has led to some volatility in the wheat and in the rice markets. Luckily, several of those have been retracted, so they were temporary. So we've seen a bit more return to calm in those markets. But we're also seeing other big changes, which I think, and that's to answer the question that was raised earlier on, that may have more lasting consequences. People buy more online. We see a rise in e-commerce. People eat more at home. We see that may be lasting. We'll have to see how that will work. As I said, we see changes in food consumption patterns. Also there, we're not sure whether it's lasting. It's some for the bad, so a bit of a return to more consumption of staple foods, but also we see as more anecdotal information we have provided by private food companies, a lot more demand for typical more healthier foods on the fear that if you're malnourished, you're obese, have diabetes, which all food-related, in part food-related problems, that then you're more vulnerable to be exposed to COVID-19. And so some people have shifting to their demand to more nutritious food. So that could be a positive outcome of this if that's a lasting impact. And last but not least, to stave off the problems in supply chains, we do see also trends with more automatization that would facilitate the social distancing measures in some of the food industries. Again, their question, is that going to be lasting? I would think yes. So I think that's also why I answered the question, how long and the impacts will be. I think the impact of this crisis will be here longer for us than 3 years. It may be a lasting, very long-term impact. Let me stop here. There's more things to say, but let's go to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Can you mention, you mentioned briefly supply chain. How resilient are the supply chains in the energy, and which are the weakest link in your opinion?
Great question. It depends on the energy source we're talking about. I mean, the more established energy supply chains, oil, for example, natural gas to an extent that can vary regionally, even coal. These supply chains are a little bit more resilient because they're more established. They've had a longer time to develop. They've been through ups and downs historically, and there have been responses as a result of that along those supply chains. And I mean, even with the extreme volatility we saw in oil markets, the price at WTI, for example, on April 20th, dropping to negative $37 and change. The volatility around that window was 15 standard deviations outside of what is normally expected. So unprecedented, but the reaction was very quick, both on the supply side as well as with regard to positions that were taken in forward markets and ultimately on the demand side. So we've seen resilience actually work itself out in that market. I think the markets that I'm really referring to, particularly with that I think might be exposed to the most risk going forward, are the ones that are developing. For example, markets for critical minerals that are really important for some of the newer energy technologies. There is a risk as governments look to, and the United States is actually involved in some of these types of discussions, right? Look to repatriate or bring some of those supply chains back domestically. That could create a massive disruption to, and this will speak to some of the questions that have come in through the Q&A, but that create a disruption to investments in green energy and sustainable energy resources. Simply because there is a reason why some of those resources are being developed in places other than the United States, right? It's because they're less expensive. And we could get into discussions as to why, but at the end of the day, when you look at mineral resources, they're heavily concentrated in terms of their development in different places around the world. And what we really ought to be discussing is ways to deepen those supply chains and think about a more diverse set of options rather than isolating development to particular areas. That's really the biggest threat I see in the energy space is the emerging energy sources. Simply because their supply chains are not as deep because they haven't had as long to develop.
Mm-hmm. Christoph, do you want to add something on the energy supply chain?
Yes, to avoid repeating what Ken has said, and I completely share what you have said, Ken. I will position my answer in a different way, more in the long term than in the short term. By resilience, we usually consider the impact of something in the short term, but given the size of the COVID crisis and the impact of the COVID crisis on global economies, I think we could also consider resilience vis-a-vis the impact of the long term. And so I have three. So then how can we say that something is resilient with this long-term view? I can see three different criteria. One, in terms of economies, countries' economies, the impact of the energy consumption vis-a-vis the GDP growth. And if we look at the historical trends, there is no decoupling between the GDP growth and energy consumption, except in some countries, which this is the case of France, but some other countries, which have started to decouple the energy consumption and their economic growth. And this is a way to increase resilience. A way to increase resilience is to be more or less dependent and to decouple growth and energy consumption. This is the first one. The second one is we could also wonder which sector of the economy is more affected by the energy crisis and by the COVID crisis. And I think it is clearly the transportation sector. We are here on the webinar, not traveling to Saudi Arabia to do this seminar. This is affecting the transport sector, clearly. So I think this is the one which is very much affected. And the last resilient field in the long run is the impact on poverty, on fuel poverty. And this is the social impact. If the COVID crisis is making energy or maybe food, depend on Rob is thinking about that, less available to people, there will be an issue on social basis, and we may see more people suffering of energy poverty than we had in the past because of the COVID crisis. This is what I wanted to say. In addition to Ken. Maybe Rob.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christophe. Rob, let's move again to food. You mentioned that this crisis actually impacted behavioral and consumption, how people consume food. Do you think actually, or should we expect food shortage to emerge? And is this crisis actually impacting or having a strong impact on small-scale farms?
Yeah, thanks, Rosa. Well, as I mentioned, I think the biggest threat is not so much food shortages per se, but the problem with people accessing food because their incomes have decreased and some food prices are increasing, particularly for more difficult sectors like fruits and vegetables and the meat and animal sourced products. So I think that's where the major risks are. So in terms of, as I mentioned, in the supply chains, the problems are specific to context and that have led to needs for major adjustments. So depending on the context, like if we take the United States, we've seen enormous problems with the meat sector because COVID-19 outbreaks in major meat processing companies, and that's had its repercussion effects for a lot of producers that, like for pig producers, that farmers have to kill a lot of their animals and so on and so forth. Likewise, in fruits and vegetable sectors, it's very dependent on migrant labor with restrictions on labor movements, both in the US and from Central America. That's been a problem. I also mentioned the issues in developing countries, which are more bread and butter issues where it's not just the farm sector that's seeing problems for harvesting per se, but also particularly in the logistics and the transport sector. So that's where food supplies can be affected because labor cannot move timely to the fields to do the harvest. And that's also seems to be part of the problem of the rising coffee prices, where some of the coffee producers are small-scale producers and are not expecting that they can harvest everything, and that's inducing some volatility in that market. But more importantly, as I mentioned, in fruits and vegetables sectors and other labor-dense production, particularly affecting smallholders, that's where these restrictions on labor could play out as a problem. Then on logistics and transports, which was also mentioned for the energy sector, that, as I mentioned, works out differently in the food sector. So freight cost by ship has gone down, and that has kept up also moving the staple foods and the basic grains. But a lot of food that gets transported internationally that are non-staples are done by international flights. International freight prices have gone up, and with the stagnation in air traffic, that has also affected food supply. So that's where we see impacts, and also that's affecting the shifts in demand because the cost of relative cost of more nutritious foods has gone up vis-a-vis the consumption of staple foods. So that's where we see those and the vulnerabilities in the system. But more generally speaking, the problems are mostly on the demand side as at the moment, and on the supply side with making or keeping food sectors essential, allowing labor to move to those sectors and work in the sector, and also freeing up these problems in logistics, then we shouldn't see major food shortages moving forward. There's no guarantee that will happen, but there's no need on that side for major problems.
Thank you very much. So, an important topic that is linked to our discussion is multilateralism. So, has the current crisis created new obstacles to multilateralism as an efficient approach for solving global energy problems? Or on the contrary, has it reinforced the international desire for multilateralism? So I will leave it to Ken to start.
Well, you would think that a crisis like this that is global in nature would stimulate a shared response in many ways. Yet we're seeing some of the institutions internationally that would typically be at the center of dealing with the COVID crisis from the health perspective under attack. And you can take a position as to whether or not the attacks are warranted or not. It really isn't the centerpiece of what I'm saying. Regardless, even if you do see deficiencies in some of those agencies, it doesn't mean abandonment of those agencies and the roles that they could play in dealing with this crisis should be forthcoming. And that to me is an example of where I think multilateralism is in many ways under attack. Now, interestingly, to bring it home to energy, which is where most of my work is engaged, we did see a coming together, if you will, when oil prices crashed. G20 issued a statement. Saudi Arabia helped, along with the United States and Russia, to come to an agreement after a disagreement at the early March OPEC Plus meetings, but they did come to an agreement on supply cuts that have really helped to restore balance to the market. So in some vectors, you're seeing multilateral approach work, yet in others, I think it's under attack. And I think it's, in short, there's no easy way to answer your question, because I think it's a very heterogeneous sort of set of answers that can ultimately be attained. It kind of is reminiscent of what we see with regard to the green energy movement and using fiscal responses to help motivate investments in the energy transition. It's varied. And it will continue to be varied. It's going to look very different in Europe, for example, than it will in North America, than it will in Africa, than it will in Latin America, than it will in Asia. Every region is going to be a little bit different. So I think in that respect, it's not necessarily appropriate to look at a global multilateral approach, but not rather a more regional one. So to the extent that European Union nations can come to agreement on green energy packages, then that is by definition a multilateral approach that would work for the region. But thinking that that might extend beyond Europe, I think is a bit of a stretch at this point in time. So again, it really just does depend on what you're talking about when you ask the question about multilateralism.
Christophe, do you agree that?
I agree, yes. If you want me to be short, I would say only one sentence.
Yeah.
We need to work for international cooperation. We need to value multilateralism. It is important. If we look in the past, if we look in the 30 years back behind us, there have been positive and negative side of globalization, if I would say. On the positive side, globalization has made it possible to decrease by a factor 2 the poverty of people. We are jumping from 1.9 billion people, which are below the level of poverty, to 7 million people. The child mortality has decreased thanks to, this is a Nobel Prize, Esther Duflo who says that. On the negative side, we have globalization has generated unemployment in the energy sector, in the food sector, in many sectors. It has generated also, it has weakened some entire regions. And now we observe the rise of populism, which is against multilateralism. So we are facing deglobalization with the USA and China trade war presently, which are also some major concerns that we should address, and in the G20 in particular. I think we need to work to be short for the return of international cooperation. In Europe, we are now developing what we name the Green Deal, which is something important. And as I said at the beginning, to finish, if I may go back to energy economics, there will be a trade-off for policymakers, and maybe in the T20 recommendation, between cost reduction and security of supply. If we want to get more security of supply, we could spread the industrial chain all over the world, but we will lose economics of scale, and we will lose on the cost aspect. So there will be a trade-off which is not easy to make, and which should be observed. This is all what I want to add.
So let me just add one thing to build on Christophe's point about the trade-offs. There is a fairly large literature in the economics domain that has looked at openness and growth, and the correlation is undeniable. There's a lot of data on this, and some of the populist sentiments that have been arising around the world really do threaten to destabilize growth. The kind of growth we've seen since the Second World War. And I think that's an area where the G20 can really help to promote the multilateral approach, because it will actually help to lift people out of poverty, which I think is critical.
Absolutely, sure, absolutely, agree. I totally agree.
Absolutely. Relating to this topic, Rob, we have seen have imposed restriction in food export as a response to COVID-19. Are these helping in any way?
Yes, well, we've seen that, but maybe first in response to what Christophe and Ken said, So I think that multilateralism is under attack, but not just because of COVID-19 that it's shown these weaknesses, but it's already something that's sometime coming. I would see when it comes to the trade restrictions, for instance, it's partly also an expression of the weakening of the World Trade Organization that should safeguard against many such measures. So luckily, in response to the trade restrictions, some countries have imposed export bans on wheat, rice, and a range of other products. They did agree to try and stop that and make countries refrain from further export restriction. We've seen some effect of that, and also the T20 Agriculture Ministerial meeting expressed its concern about these trade restrictions. So at the height of these measures were about 20 countries that had imposed export restrictions on food products, and now that's down to, I think, 12 or so. We have a food trade policy tracker that is updated every day to track that. Luckily, we haven't seen it to the extent that this happened, because it happened before in the late 2000s with the global food price crisis, 2007, 2008. Many countries took these measures and they proved to be counterproductive. So the idea was that by imposing export restrictions, you keep more of your foods for your domestic market, and that will help lower the domestic price for consumers at the same time. But what happened at the time, and we see a similar effect now, is that when you restrict supplies on the global market, then global market prices will go up. Then other countries may react to that by lowering their import tariffs and trying to reduce domestic prices. And that in turn then tightens the global market because of increased demand. And in the end, everybody loses because you get overall price increases. So counterproductive to what has happened. So as I mentioned, these counterproductive impacts we've seen in the wheat and the rice markets, but they have attenuated over the past couple of weeks, thanks to the retraction of at least of some of these export bans. So I think that this is one particular area. I think the other areas where we, I think, may mention three of them, which are important to consider for concerted global action. The first is better monitoring mechanisms of supply disruptions, food price volatility. The G20 has the Agriculture Market Information System, which was set up in the late 2000s in response to the global food price crisis, but that only monitors the staple foods. And I think it's much more important that that gets expanded into other products, particularly also to fruits, vegetables, and others, not just in global markets, but in specific domestic markets at the same time. The second point is to keep trade channels open. It's essential to keep the supply of food flowing, but also keep stability in markets, as well as allow labor to move to the fields, as I mentioned earlier on. So restrictions on migratory patterns could be devastating, at least in the short run, to the supply. And last but not least, I could mention more, but I think, as I mentioned, the main risk to food security is in the global recessionary impacts. And rich countries have taken unprecedented measures to protect their population against income falls. But developing countries that are going to be hit or are being hit harder because of the international transmission effects, they don't have that fiscal space. So we have seen the IMF and the World Bank provide some additional financial support to countries, but a lot more would be needed. And I think it would be in the self-interest also of the rich countries to put more of their fiscal stimulus measures in supporting poorer countries to expand social protection programs and other ways to mitigate the worst of this crisis, because otherwise we might get large-scale food crisis. And as we know, that could fire back because we know food insecurity is one of the big triggers of conflict and forced migration in developing countries. So that could be politically destabilizing. So it would be very important for the international community to look at those risks and come together with concerted action.
Thank you very much, Rob. Actually, your answer actually moved us to addressing the questions that we are receiving from the audience. And I think you addressed one of the questions, which is related to global food trade policies and food price. Do you expect food price to rise up again? This is the part of the question at the end.
Well, it depends. So we've not seen major food price spikes. So certainly not for the basic food products. That's in part because most markets are well stocked. Production prospects are pretty good. But we've seen increased volatility recently in the wheat and rice markets for the reasons I mentioned. And so rice prices have gone up in part because of these export restrictions, and some big players like in the rice markets like Vietnam had to impose these restrictions. Those have now ended, and we've seen recently again slight declines in rice prices. So I don't think we're in the same situation as in the end of the 2000s when markets were very tight. But in certain segments of the market, we can see spikes in food prices, particularly what we're seeing in some of the more vulnerable products, perishable products in fruits, vegetables, well, some certain meat products where we get supply disruption. So we've seen spikes in prices around the world, particularly in developing countries, particularly for those food items. So that we need to keep an eye on. But from what I said before is in principle, we should not be seeing these problems if we take good care that our supply chains keep flowing through open trade channels, but also making sure that the logistics in food sectors keep functioning. And in some cases that will require quite a bit of extra effort from particularly in developing country governments to improve their infrastructure and invest in logistics in food supply chains.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Christoph, there's another question is, do you think COVID-19 disruption along with oil prices affected investments in clean energy transitions? And if so, what can be done to safeguard sustainable energy and keep energy transitions on top of the agenda of T20?
Okay. Well, it's true that there is an issue on energy transition, and we can wonder if because of the need for financing the restart of the economy, there will be enough resources to finance, to subsidize renewable energy sources. In some markets, renewable energy sources do not need any subsidies, but in most of them, they need some support to be developed. And so the question is whether this development, which is part of the energy transition, will be feasible. And one can see many stakeholders taking position to prevent this lack of feasibility. And so there is one issue. On the other hand, as I said, the COVID crisis has, or at least in major cities, or in Beijing, in Paris, in Washington, people have discovered clean air they discovered the bikes, they discovered the environment values, and so they may be more supportive for vis-a-vis energy transition issues. So I am quite optimistic on the fact that, but this is a personal view, on the fact that energy transition are not going to be pushed away by this COVID crisis. In the opposite, to be short.
Okay, thank you. Ken, do you want to add on this question? Or I have another question for you.
Sure, I'll add to it, and then I'll take whatever else you want to throw at me. The energy transition is not going to stop. I think, though, you're going to see a much more diverse approach around the world as some of the fiscal stresses and economic pressures that have been exerted on countries everywhere will really force a refocusing on areas where countries have what economists refer to as a comparative advantage. So I think that means in some regions you'll see rapid scale development of renewables that can work together. So for example, wind and hydro in Northwest Europe, I think has a lot of potential because hydro is, quite frankly, the world's best battery. It can load follow, it can balance intermittency. There's lots of things that it can do to really help the expansion of wind and solar and other renewable resources. Of course, that all requires transmission, so investment's going to be needed. But that's true everywhere. And there are places around the world, for example, in North America, in the New England, Eastern Canadian region, you've got a similar sort of geographic and topographic and resource endowment in place to do wind and hydro. You just need transmission. So I think when we look at different places around the world, there will be latitude for different opportunities to reveal themselves. In places that are have a significant advantage in oil and gas production, for example, I think hydrogen is something that those regions will begin to look at in earnest. This is not going to happen in 2 or 3 years. This is something that is a long game. But without a doubt, when you start talking about generating economic activity, it is critical to focus on areas regionally where you have a comparative advantage so that you can actually see growth. And what we ultimately need to figure out is how do you actually sustain growth in both the economic sense, but also the environmental sense. And that's where comparative advantage plays a huge role. So I did see a question come across about hydrogen, and I do think you will see countries around the world that have significant endowments in fossil fuels begin to look at hydrogen in earnest, because it is a way to decarbonize if you couple it with carbon capture. And typically, if you're running through a standard technology like an SMR technology, you can actually get a very high purity stream of CO2 that's relatively easy to capture. So I think some of those things will play to the advantage of the energy transition as we move forward.
Thank you very much, Ken. So the question that I wanted to ask you, and it came from the audience, is related to the impact of the low oil prices on the oil industry, especially the US tight oil industry. Many oil companies cut down on their expenditures, and most shut in many of their producers. Will the shale industry survive this downturn?
Yes. I'll give you a brief elaboration on that, but yes, without a doubt. Look, the rock is the rock. The geology doesn't change. In many ways, as we entered this year, there was a growing consensus that we would see some bankruptcies because of an inability by some smaller producers to generate positive cash flow and positive returns for the last decade, really. And sources of capital were drying up as a result of that. And so that really did signal there was going to be some turnover in the shale space in the United States. But the key word there is turnover, right? Because anytime you go through a period like this, the mergers and acquisition space can accelerate. in terms of what's going on. And that ultimately means that larger scale players with a different type of capital discipline that can bring different types of economies of scale and technologies to the field will be able to step in and do so where they see a profitable opportunity. And we saw that post 2016. So if you recall, back from late 2014 through mid 2016, oil prices went through a pretty significant slide, bottoming out in the high $20 a barrel range. The shale sector went through some significant pain. U.S. oil production dropped by a little over 1 million barrels a day. Assets changed hands, and when prices recovered, we saw over the next into early this year, over the next 3.5 years, U.S. oil production, or liquids production overall, increased by a little over 4 million barrels a day. So a lot of that, yes, was owed to higher prices as we moved out of 2016, but a lot of it was also owed to the ownership structure in the space. So I think as we move forward, you're going to see similar sorts of things happen. I'm not predicting another 4 to 4.5 million barrel a day increase in oil production from the U.S. by any means, but I do think you will see a more sustained level of activity that will lead ultimately to a plateau in oil production in the U.S., but it's going to be done by a completely different type of operator, one that's much more capital disciplined.
Thank you very much, Ken. Rob, there's an interesting question on attack of locust. So this year, attack of locust has come in a big way. Another wave is likely to hit. How this factor be also internalized to sustain food and nutrition security?
Yeah, that's a good question. A couple of 2 months ago, the director of the World Food Program, when talking about the potential impact of COVID-19, he said it could have biblical impacts on food security and increase the food crisis. I guess the locust crisis, which is now affecting East Africa and parts of India and Pakistan, that would even be more biblical if that affects and eats away the crop. So for now, those are big risks in those regions. They're local, so it's East Africa, particularly Ethiopia, parts of Kenya, Somalia, but as I mentioned, it's now also expanding to India and Pakistan. So for those parts, that there is the risk that major crops will be lost, major harvest will be lost, and that will no doubt increase hunger and food insecurity in those parts of the world. And it's very difficult to since it's already, the outbreak is already there, to stave it off at this moment. So it's particularly in terms of compensatory measures that we have to work to avoid that spreads further in terms of the impacts of food shortages that may cause in those parts of the world. So I think, yeah, the locust is one big threat. But it's also, I think, a warning signal. It should be a warning signal to everyone that we will see more of these kinds of impacts from that. There are combinations of climatic factors and local conditions that cause the spread of the locust, right? And but we'll see more of them. If it's not COVID-19, we may see other zoonotic diseases spread into the food systems and threaten humans' health. So I think what that should show is the need, again, for more international cooperation to prevent and build more resilience against those risks to our food systems.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I think we just have 5 minutes to conclude our panel. So I want to ask the panelists, what lessons should we learn from the COVID-19 crisis? And how could the crisis response be leveraged to create more resilient and sustainable food and energy system? In short, what actions would you recommend to the G20? So, and I will leave it to 2 minutes for each of you, please.
Shall I start?
Yeah.
So the lessons for the COVID crisis. I think we need more collaboration for environmental policies. This is affecting both food and energy systems. We need to do it at global scale. If we do it at local scale, each country will understand that fighting against climate change alone is inefficient and there is no interest. Fighting against pollution, local pollution also requires to have international standards. So I think the first lesson is to maintain multilateralism as much as possible. And the second lesson, considering your question on making systems more resilient with that, I think we, as Rob just said, we need to increase the role of international institutions. We are talking about G20, but we have plenty of other international institutions. We have the IRENA for renewable energy. We have in Vienna, the International Atomic Energy Agency. We have the International Energy Agency in Paris, which is still measuring the impact of the crisis. And we are talking today of the COVID-19 crisis without knowing yet how long it will last. Will there be a second wave? So there is a lot of uncertainty. We need to rely on these international bodies, and this is something which could be stated by the T20 recommendation to enhance the role and the capacity to act to these international bodies. 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. Ken, Rob, anyone?
I'll go ahead and give Rob the last word. So I think what this crisis highlights is the importance of resilience. I think you sort of summarized it nicely there. And resilience is a broad concept that really should be applied across the board to multiple things. We've talked about supply chains. We've talked about resilience in demand in sort of a backhanded way without really addressing it. But this gets into really understanding how to build more resilient economic systems so that supply chains are not disrupted in massive ways. And I think that's really where you could have an incredibly interdisciplinary and multilateral approach to addressing some of the concerns that have been raised, not only in this discussion today, but just in general as the COVID-19 crisis is unfolded. I think in order to do that, and I think this is something that is often lost in the discussion where we talk about policy measures to, get something to happen, is the role that innovation plays in all of this. I think it's incredibly important. I often say that the next great innovation is in the mind of a 4-year-old somewhere playing with Legos. We don't know what it is. We need to foster systems that encourage creativity, don't suppress it, encourage diversity, encourage multiple ways of thinking about singular issues, because the more we do that, the more likely that next great innovation will emerge and really ultimately change the world. So I think that's something, if we're going to put a long-term view on this, that's something, if we're going to talk about resilience in the long term, we really need to be focused on.
Thank you very much, Wilson.
Well, let me pick up first from both Christoph's and Ken's points. This crisis makes clear that international cooperation is more needed than ever. This is a global pandemic which affects everybody or puts everybody at risk. So without good international cooperation, we cannot resolve these problems, and that should be a good lesson moving forward. Second, I also like to underline the importance of resilience. But resilience is no good if we cannot also make food systems sustainable. from an environmental perspective, but particularly also what this crisis made clear, that we may need food systems that cater for healthy diets. Right? We also know, and that reiterates this crisis, the top two health risks, global health risks, are food related. 5 of the top 10 health risks are food related. And we know from COVID-19, if you're badly nourished, be it undernourished or overnourished, you're at greater risk of being infected by this disease, and at a greater risk also of dying from it. So hopefully what we're seeing as sort of some glimmers of hope in some shifts in consumption patterns that can be leveraged and made clear to the world that what we need is to not just address this specific health crisis, but it's linked to other crises and weaknesses in our food systems and in our energy systems and the economic systems at large. So if we don't address them all at the same time, then we're bound to have multiple crises moving forward, and that's what we want to prevent. So hopefully that can be a lesson. We need resilient, sustainable, and healthy food systems.
Yes. Totally agree, Rob. So let's end on a positive note that we need cooperation, healthy diet, healthy system, and we need innovation, encouraging innovation. Thank you very much. Over to you, Majid.
Thank you, Dr. Mutairi and our esteemed panelists for your fruitful discussions and for sharing your insights. The next item on our agenda is Task Force 10 updates. But before I walk you through these updates, I would like first to thank our attendees, our authors, on behalf of the task force leadership. In particular, I want to thank our authors for their valuable contribution, dedication, and patience during the past few months. We are halfway through, and we still have a few milestones to achieve together. By January the 4th, and before the inception, we received more than 90 abstracts, where 46 abstracts were accepted. Because many of these abstracts had similar narratives, the review committee decided to combine and merge many of them into ultimately producing 18 policy briefs and a vision paper. We reached out to you to work together. It was not easy in the beginning for some of you, but you all managed very well in communicating and synergizing your ideas to produce key recommendations. By now, you all have received the comments and edits on your policy brief drafts. You are requested to reflect these edits and comments and resubmit your revised policy drafts by the end of June. In less than 2 weeks, you will be invited to present your policy recommendations during the upcoming T20 workshop. Each policy brief will be assigned 3 to 5 minutes to share your recommendations. The T20 summit is still taking place between October 31st and November 1st. Whether physical or virtual, that depends. We'll keep you abreast. Details of the workshop and the summit will be shared with you right after the session. I will pause now for a few moments and see if you have any questions or inquiries. Great. Now with that, I would like to thank you all for attending this webinar. We would like to thank our panelists, our presenters for their valuable contribution to today's program. Please stay safe and healthy, keep practice social distancing, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Dr. Al-Mutairi, Dr. Turki, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Majid, and I would like to echo your thanks to the members of the task force. Again, I would like to extend invitation to all who participated here today to also join us on June 15 and June 16 and 17 on our web conference, mid-year web conference, where we will reflect on the policy briefs that we have received so far, as well as interact with chairs of the working groups to see how the pandemic affected the T20 priorities, and that will hopefully help us in terms of reflecting these changes in the priorities on our policy recommendations. So thank you, Margaret.
Thank you very much for everyone for participating today, and thank you very much for the keynote speakers and the panelists, and stay safe. See you soon in June workshop.
Thank you all. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.